Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're cracking open a really foundational text, one that kind of shifted how we look at society and belief. It's excerpts from the elementary forms of the religious life.
Right. And this source, it takes us way back to what are seen as, well, maybe the simplest forms of human groups and religion itself. We're focusing in on totemism, especially in Australian tribes.
Yeah, and not just to understand, ancient beliefs.
No, exactly. It's about what these early forms can tell us about thinking, about how human thought itself might have developed.
And this source, it starts with a really bold idea, doesn't it? It kind of lays out this core principle.
It does. The premise is that human institutions, things like religion, they have to stick around for a reason. They can't just be like a big mistake or based on nothing.
They have to hold to reality, as the text puts it.
Precisely. There has to be something real underpinning them. So our job here is to dig into these elementary forms and try to find that reality.
Okay, so if it's not just error, what is it? Where does the source start looking for that core reality of religion?
Well, first, it sort of pushes aside the things we might immediately think of, gods, spirits.
Yeah, the usual suspects.
Right. The source argues those aren't necessarily the most basic, the most universal features you find everywhere.
So what is?
It points to one single defining characteristic, something found, it argues, in all religions, always. And that's this absolute separation, this complete difference between two realms, the sacred and the profane.
Sacred and profane, okay. And these aren't just like different levels.
No, it's more radical than that. They're presented as two completely separate worlds,
Yeah.
fundamentally distinct.
Yeah.
Like oil and water, they just don't mix.
So sacred doesn't just mean, a god in the sky.
Not at all. Anything, literally anything, can become sacred. A rock, a specific tree, even just a word, a gesture, a person.
What makes it sacred then?
Being set apart, being surrounded by rules, by what the source calls interdictions, taboos, things you absolutely cannot do in relation to it. The forces in this sacred world aren't just like stronger versions of everyday forces. They're different in kind.
Okay. And how does that help distinguish religion from something like, say, magic? They can seem similar sometimes.
That's a great point. The source draws a really key distinction there. It says religion has something magic lacks. A church.
At church, you mean like a building?
No, not necessarily a building, more like a moral community. It's formed by all the believers in a single faith, lay people and priests, everyone together. Magic might have its practitioners, its clients, but it doesn't usually have that unified collective body of believers.
Ah, I see. So religion is fundamentally social, collective.
Eminently collective, yes.
Yeah.
That's central. And this collective aspect, plus the sacred-profane divide, is why the source critiques some earlier theories.
Like animism, believing in spirits from dreams.
Exactly. Or naturism religion coming from watching storms or the sun. The source finds those ideas just don't quite explain this absolute split between sacred and profane, or why religion is always such a group activity.
Which kind of naturally leads us into the main focus then, totemism.
Right. Totemism, especially as studied in certain Australian tribes, is presented as maybe the simplest, most basic form of religion and social organization we know of. It's all built around clans.
Clans, and the core idea is some kind of a connection.
A mystical connection, yeah.
Yeah.
A really deep bond between the group, the clan, and usually a particular species of animal or plant.
Like the kangaroo clan or the emu clan.
Exactly like that. Though sometimes it can be linked to other things too, landscapes, stars, natural forces, but typically animals or plants.
Okay, and what different kinds of totems are there?
Well, the main one, the big one, is the collective totem. That's the emblem for the whole clan.
So everyone in the kangaroo clan shares the kangaroo totem.
Yes. And the bonds are incredibly tight. They share the totem's name, they use its image as their emblem, they believe they have special relationships with actual kangaroos, and importantly, they all practice the same rites related to it.
You mentioned the images. Are they particularly important?
Hugely important. Often, the source notes the representation of the totem painted on shields, carved into objects, drawn on the body. That image is considered even more sacred than the actual animal itself.
Wow. So the symbol is more powerful than the thing.
In a way, yes.
Hmm?
And this whole system, it doesn't just define the clan, it actually structures how they see the entire world. Everything out there, other animals, plants, even directions or weather phenomena, gets classified and assigned to one clan or another based on its supposed relationship to their totem.
Wait, so classifying the natural world, that stems from how society is classified.
That's a huge takeaway the source builds towards, absolutely. The way humans group themselves provides the model for how they group everything else. We'll definitely come back to that.
Okay, so collective totem. What else?
Then there's the individual totem. This is much more personal. A specific emblem linked just to one person.
Like a personal guardian spirit.
That's one way to think about it. Theories vary. Maybe it's like an external soul, offering protection. Or maybe it represents the individual's own dual nature, the everyday profane self and the part that connects to the sacred, the social group. Sometimes it's seen as sort of a secondary totem, linked to the main clan totem.
Interesting. And there was a third type.
Yes, sexual group totems. These are fascinating. They're not tied to clans, but to gender. All the men in a tribe might share one totem, and all the women share another.
Regardless of clan.
Exactly. The source mentions the Kurnai tribe, for example. All men were linked to the emu wren, all women to the linnet. These were seen as protectors for their respective gender group. You couldn't harm or eat the totem associated with your sex.
Okay, so we have these different totems, clan, individual, gender. They're linked to specific things, animals, plants, images. But then the source takes a big turn, right? It starts talking about something less tangible.
Yes, this is where it gets really deep. The argument shifts from the totemic object, the kangaroo, the image, to the force that seems to lie behind it all.
A force, not the animal itself.
Not ultimately. The source suggests the real object of worship, the thing people are really engaging with in the totemic cult, isn't just the species. It's more like a vague power spread through these things, an impersonal energy, a principle.
That sounds a bit like concepts like mana from Melanesia or wakan from the Sioux, that idea of a diffuse, non-personal power.
Precisely. The source explicitly draws that parallel, mana, wakan. These are terms for a kind of universal life force, energy, power, effectiveness that isn't located in a specific deity. The totemic principle, as the source calls it, is seen as a similar kind of impersonal force, just maybe more localized or focused through the totem.
Okay, an impersonal force.
Yeah.
But here's the massive question, the core argument of the whole book, really. Where does this powerful sacred force actually come from? What's its origin?
And the answer provided is revolutionary, especially for its time. The source argues, quite directly, it comes from society. Society itself is the ultimate source of the sacred.
Whoa. Okay, hang on. Society, like the group of people, creates the sacred. How? How does just being in a group generate this feeling of an immense external sacred power?
It happens through the way society impacts the individual. Think about it. First, society acts as this powerful moral force. It gives us rules, commands respect, makes us feel dependent on it. We feel its authority.
Right, you feel social pressure, obligations.
Exactly. That feeling of an external power shaping your behavior, that's part of it. But it's not just about constraint. Society also elevates us.
Elevates. How so?
When you're part of a group, especially in moments of collective action or celebration, you feel bigger than yourself, don't you? You feel this surge of energy, this sense of shared purpose, maybe even a feeling of transformation. You feel stronger, more capable.
Yeah, like being swept up in a crowd or that feeling at a really intense concert or something.
That's getting close. The source has a specific term for the peak moments of this: collective effervescence. These are times when the group comes together, physically big ceremonies, dances, feasts, like the Australian carvery.
Oh, okay.
In those moments, the social energy is incredibly intense. Everyone feels it simultaneously. There's this emotional and intellectual fusion, and that feeling, that overwhelming sense of being part of something powerful, external, and utterly different from everyday life, that is what gets interpreted as a sacred force.
So that intense communal feeling is the raw material for the sacred.
That's the argument. It's not an illusion. It's the real power of the collective being felt directly by its members. That energy then gets projected onto symbols, like the totem, and perceived as this external sacred power. The religious force is real because the social force is real.
Mind blown. Okay, so that explains the origin of the sacred feeling, the belief, but what about the actions, the rituals, the ceremonies, the cult?
Right, the beliefs need practices. The source dives deep into the rites. It broadly categorizes them. First up are the negative rites. Think prohibitions, taboos.
Their job is just keeping things separate, sacred from profane.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Maintaining that absolute boundary, protecting the sacred from being contaminated or weakened by contact with the profane, and vice versa, protecting the profane from the potentially dangerous power of the sacred.
And the sacredness, it can spread.
Yes, that's a key idea. The contagiousness of sacredness. It's believed that sacredness can be transmitted through touch, proximity, even just association of ideas. If a sacred object touches a profane one, the profane one might become dangerously charged, or the sacred object might be polluted.
So that's why there's so many complex rules
Yeah,
about who can touch what, when.
exactly. Rules about handling sacred objects, entering sacred places, avoiding contact with certain people, like mourners or initiates. Rules about food. It all stems from managing this contagious quality. Think about rules surrounding death, avoiding the deceased's belongings or the place they died. That's about containing the sacred and dangerous quality associated with death.
It sounds like a lot of don'ts. Is there a kind of self-denial aspect to it?
Definitely. The source talks about an ascetic dimension. All these prohibitions, but also practices involving self-inflicted pain, common in initiation rites, like scarring, knocking out teeth, biting the scalp.
Ouch. Why?
They're seen as a necessary school, a way to toughen individuals, to teach discipline, self-control, detachment from purely physical or personal concerns. It prepares them to endure hardship and properly participate in the sacred life of the group. There's even a sense that enduring suffering can itself build spiritual strength or virtue.
Okay, so negative rites are about separation and discipline. What about positive rites?
These are the active ceremonies, the performances. Often they look like attempts to influence the world directly.
Like trying to make the totemic animal multiply or bring rain?
Exactly. The source gets examples like the Intichiuma ceremonies. These involve things like clan members imitating the movements of their totem animal, sometimes shedding their own blood on sacred ground, dancing around the totemic emblem, maybe ritually consuming a small part of the totem, all aimed at ensuring the species flourishes.
And rain ceremonies.
Yeah, like the Kaddish tribe pouring water over special stones or building and then ritually destroying little huts meant to represent clouds dispersing to bring rain. The goal seems practical, physical.
Seems practical, but you're going to tell me there's a deeper layer.
Of course. The source argues that while these rites have these apparent goals, their fundamental underlying function is social. It's about bringing the group together.
How so?
These ceremonies are occasions where the clan or the whole society reaffirms its existence, strengthens its shared beliefs, and literally recharges its collective energy. Coming together, performing these shared actions, focusing on the common symbol, it powerfully reinforces social bonds and collective identity. The physical goal, more kangaroos, more rain, might even be secondary or something that got attached later to what was originally a moral or social ritual.
So it's like a community pep rally, but with sacred significance.
You could sort of think of it that way, yeah. It revivifies the collective spirit. And there's often a strong aesthetic element to dance, song, decoration. It's performance.
Okay, negative rites, positive rites. What's the last category? Piacular rites. That sounds ominous.
They are associated with difficult times, misfortune, sadness, fear, especially mourning after a death.
And the practices are intense.
Extremely intense. The source paints a vivid picture based on observer accounts. Think loud, synchronized wailing, people injuring themselves, cutting their thighs, gashing their heads until they're covered in blood, tearing out hair, coating themselves in white clay as a sign of mourning. Really dramatic, public displays of grief.
Is that just pure, uncontrolled sorrow?
The source argues it's more structured than that. Yes, there's grief, but there's also a social obligation. Society basically requires its members to demonstrate this intense sorrow and even anger. The loss of a member diminishes the whole group, and the rites express that collective wound and the group's reaction against it.
Anger, too, mixed with the sorrow.
Yes, a kind of agitated state where sorrow mixes with frustration or anger, leading to these sometimes violent acts directed at oneself, or historically, perhaps, towards an enemy group suspected of causing the death, a possible root of blood feuds.
So the group kind of works itself up into this state.
In a way, yes. And here's another counterintuitive idea. The source proposes that it's not necessarily an inherent fear of the dead person's ghost that causes these rites. Rather, the sheer intensity and collective nature of the mourning rituals themselves create the powerful, sacred, and potentially dangerous character attributed to the deceased.
The ritual makes the dead person scary.
Or at least reinforces their sacred, set-apart status. But these rites, while starting from sorrow, also have a function. Over time, they help channel and eventually resolve the grief, allowing the group to heal, reintegrate, and reaffirm its solidarity even after suffering a loss.
It really underscores how deeply social these religious practices are. But the source goes even further, doesn't it? Suggesting religion is at the root of, well, how we think.
This is maybe the most ambitious and potentially controversial claim. The argument is that religion, specifically this kind of collective religious thought emerging from social life, is the very origin of the fundamental categories of human understanding, the basic framework of the intelligence.
Categories, what do you mean,
Like our basic concepts of time, space, class or classification, force, causality, even our idea of personality or a soul, and maybe even logic itself, like the principle of contradiction.
wait, those ideas came from religion, not just from observing the world or being human.
The argument is they didn't arise spontaneously in individual minds just looking at nature. They are collective representations. They are shared ways of organizing experience that were forged by and within society, often through its religious life.
Okay, you have to give me examples. How does religion shape something like time?
Well, think about how we measure time beyond just day and night. The source points to the rhythm of social life, especially the cycle of religious festivals, ceremonies, and assemblies. These recurring collective events provide a shared, impersonal framework. They create points on a timeline that everyone recognizes, allowing people to coordinate activities and think about duration in an abstract way beyond just their personal experience. It imposes a social rhythm onto the flow of events.
So the calendar basically starts with religious holidays.
In essence, yes, that regular pulse of collective activity provides the initial structure. And space, similar idea. How a society organizes itself physically, the layout of the camp, the territories of different clans. This social organization of space influences the very concept of space as an abstract container.
And you mentioned classification before.
Right. This is a really clear example in the source. How do we get the idea of sorting things into classes or categories? The argument is, we first learned to classify things by modeling it on how we classify people into clans, phrases, moieties. The social group provides the blueprint for logical grouping. The idea of species or kind is born from the idea of the clan.
That's wild. What about force and causality, cause and effect?
The prototype for our idea of an effective force, something that can make things happen, is argued to be the collective force of society itself. Individuals feel this force acting on them, compelling them, enabling them. They see it achieve results through collective actions and rituals. The efficacy attributed to rites making rain, healing the sick, reinforces this notion of impersonal forces acting causally in the world. Society's pressure is the model for physical pressure, in a sense.
And our sense of having a soul or a personality.
This reflects, according to the source, a real duality we experience. We have our individual body, our day-to-day profane existence. But we also have a part of us that connects to the group, to the moral rules, to the sacred ideas, our conscience, our social self. This inner part is society living within us. The concept of the soul arises to represent this internalization of the collective, this spark of divinity, which is really the spark of the social.
So the feeling of being torn between desire and duty, that's the profane self versus the sacred social self.
That's a good way to put it. And even basic logic, like the principle of contradiction, that something can't be both itself and its opposite. The source speculates might have roots in social structures, perhaps in the clear opposition between distinct social groups like clans or phrases that have mutually exclusive identities or roles.
So these fundamental ways of thinking, they aren't just innate, they're like software that society installed.
That's a modern analogy, but yeah, something like that. They're presented as priceless instruments of thought, intellectual tools built up over millennia by human groups, passed down through collective life, primarily through religious frameworks initially. Without these shared categories, imposed by the group, shared understanding and coordinated life would be impossible. Society ensures we all use the same basic operating system, you could say.
Which brings us back full circle to society creating the sacred, creating the ideal.
Exactly. Society, through these shared beliefs, collective rituals, and moments of effervescence, generates not just rules, but an ideal world, a realm of higher values, moral authority, shared meanings that transcends the messy, everyday, profane world. This ideal realm feels more real, more powerful.
But it's not just in our heads.
No, crucially, the source insists it's not an illusion. This ideal world, while existing in thought and expressed through symbols, is grounded in the reality of the collective life. It reflects the real power and structure of society. The symbols might be imperfect, but they point to something real, the social being.
And that feeling of having a soul, that inner duality.
That's the echo of this collective reality within the individual. It's society establishing itself inside us, making us feel like we're composed of these two parts, the biological individual and the social person.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We dove into this really foundational text, looking at the simplest forms of religion, like totemism.
And found the argument that religion is, at its heart, a social thing. It's society reflecting on itself, feeling its own power, and expressing that power through sacred symbols and forces.
It's not just about explaining the world, but about binding the group together, creating shared feelings and shared ways of acting through these intricate rites, negative, positive, piacular.
And then the really big leap,
Yeah.
that this collective religious life didn't just shape behavior, it actually forged the fundamental categories of our thought: time, space, class, cause, force, soul. These basic tools we use to understand everything.
So the source concludes, even these seemingly primitive religious forms are deeply well-founded in reality, the reality of society itself.
It definitely makes you rethink where our most basic assumptions about the world might come from.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with this final thought for you, the listener. If our core mental concepts, how we perceive time, how we organize space, how we understand cause and effect, how we classify everything, if these have their roots deep in the collective religious life and social structure of early human groups, what does it really tell you about the nature of knowledge, about how much the social world, past and present, shapes the very way your mind works today, perhaps in ways you don't even realize?
What other parts of your thinking, your assumptions, might have origins not just in logic or observation, but in the unseen patterns of collective life? Something to definitely chew on. Till next time.